Usually when we talk about pushing our human limits, there's this expectation of just sheer agony.
Oh, absolutely. It's that classic, well, that no pain, no gain mentality we all grew up with.
You picture like a marathon runner literally collapsing at the finish line, or maybe a medical student pulling some grueling caffeine-fueled all-nighter.
Yeah, we're taught pretty early on that extreme effort has to equal extreme stress and exhaustion. If you aren't suffering, you probably just aren't trying hard enough.
But then, I mean, you look at a ballet dancer executing this flawless, gravity-defying routine, or you watch a software developer writing thousands of lines of elegant code for 8 hours straight without even blinking.
And suddenly that whole equation just completely breaks down.
Exactly. We're looking at a state of human performance where this intense limit-stretching effort actually feels completely effortless. It's a total paradox.
It really is. I mean, how can doing the absolute hardest thing you've ever done feel incredibly easy and totally eliminate stress? It defies our normal understanding of work and reward.
Which is exactly the paradox we're decoding today for you on this deep dive.
Because in those moments, the brain shifts into a completely different gear. It's basically the peak of human consciousness.
Yeah, and we've got a massive stack of sources for you today to figure this out. We're talking foundational psychology articles, cutting-edge neuroscience research papers, plus practical guides from Headspace, The Guardian, and the Flaw Research Collective.
It's a lot of material, but the mission here is really clear. We want to decode the actual brain science behind what we call the flow state.
And more importantly, we want to give you the mechanics, like how you can actually engineer this peak state of experience in your own daily life. Because, spoiler alert, this isn't magic.
No, not at all. It's not some mystical superpower reserved for, Olympic athletes or Silicon Valley tech billionaires.
Right, it's a biological state that your brain is fully capable of entering, provided you give it the specific environmental and cognitive inputs it needs to boot up that operating system.
But to understand how to trigger those inputs, it really helps to look at how scientists even realized this state existed in the first place.
Because for the longest time, psychology basically just assumed humans only did hard things to get a reward at the end, right?
Exactly. I mean, we have to look back to the 1960s and 70s for this. There was this foundational work by a Hungarian-American psychologist named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, along with his fellow researcher, G. Nakamura.
Csikszentmihalyi. I practiced saying that name so many times before we started.
You nailed it. But yeah, they were looking into the creative process, specifically studying painters. And Csikszentmihalyi would just watch these artists work relentlessly for hours, or sometimes even days at a time.
Just completely ignoring their fundamental biological needs.
Totally. They wouldn't eat, they wouldn't sleep, they wouldn't even take a break to sit down. They were just entirely consumed by the canvas.
Which, okay, makes sense if they're trying to finish a masterpiece to sell it. But that wasn't what was happening.
Right. The catch was what happened when the painting was actually finished. The very moment the final brushstroke was applied, the artist would almost entirely lose interest in the piece.
Which is wild to think about.
They just didn't care about the final product sitting there on the easel.
Yeah.
They weren't stepping back to admire it. They weren't rushing out to try and sell it.
And that completely contradicted traditional behavioral psychology at the time. I mean, the whole premise was that humans are solely motivated by external rewards. You work hard to get the paycheck, or the applause, or the beautiful painting for your wall.
But for these painters, the painting itself wasn't the reward. Csikszentmihalyi realized that the process of painting was the true reward.
The doing of the thing.
Exactly. And he expanded his research to include surgeons, chess players, rock climbers, dancers, and he found the exact same phenomenon across the board.
The happiest, most optimal moments in these people's lives weren't when they were, relaxing on a beach drinking a cocktail.
No, the peak moments occurred when their bodies and minds were voluntarily stretched to their absolute limits to accomplish something incredibly difficult. He coined a term for this, actually. He called it an autotelic experience.
Autotelic. So auto meaning self and telos meaning goal. The activity basically has a purpose in and of itself.
Right. You're doing the thing purely for the joy of doing the thing, not for any external praise or profit.
And in this state, your action and your awareness just merge seamlessly. You aren't thinking about doing the task. You essentially become the task.
And the mechanism behind how this actually works in the brain is just Fascinating.
Yeah, I love this part. Because Csikszentmihalyi found that the human mind can only consciously process about 120 bits of information per second.
That's our hard bandwidth limit.
Exactly. Think of your brain like a computer's RAM, right?
Yeah.
It's short-term memory. If you and I are having a conversation, that takes up about 60 bits per second just to decode the words and formulate a response.
Which completely explains why you can't listen to two people talking to you at the exact same time and understand both of them.
You literally don't have the processing power. You can't decode 120 bits of auditory information simultaneously. Your brain has to choose one or the other.
So when you're fully challenged and engaged in an activity you're passionate about, like the painter at the canvas, or honestly, even you trying to beat a really complex video game, you are maxing out that 120-bit RAM.
You're using every single bit of processing power for the task right in front of you.
Because you're at maximum capacity, your brain has to aggressively triage its resources. It just forces background apps to close down.
Oh, this is the best part. So your perception of time passing simply gets shut off because tracking time requires processing power.
Yes. Your sense of hunger or that weird ache in your lower back muted.
Even your own sense of self-consciousness, like your inner critic, gets force quit. There is absolutely no bandwidth left to run those background programs.
Which makes so much sense when you think about why people emerge from a flow state feeling incredibly refreshed instead of exhausted, even if they've been working for 6 hours straight.
Because your brain hasn't been wasting any energy processing anxiety or self-doubt or, staring at a clock. It's been entirely unified in one singular direction.
And we can actually see this physical shift happening under the hood. Let's look at the default mode network, or the DMN.
The DMN, this is a big one.
It's massive. This is a network in your brain that is highly active when you're daydreaming, ruminating, or just letting your mind wander.
It's basically the autobiography center of the brain, right? It's constantly generating your sense of ego and simulating past regrets or future anxieties.
Exactly. But during flow, the brain physically reallocates energy away from the DMN. It deactivates it.
Because the brain has a hyper-specific immediate goal right in front of it, it doesn't need to dedicate energy to simulating the future or worrying about the past.
Right. And while the DMN powers down, the amygdala, which is the brain's alarm system responsible for processing fear and threat detection, that also loses blood flow.
Wow. So because you're hyper-focused on this micro-level task, the brain just stops scanning the macro environment for potential threats.
It creates a physiological environment that is completely free of stress, worry, and the fear of failure.
And meanwhile, the brain's reward system kicks in. We hear a lot about dopamine flooding the system during flow, but it's not just some random dump of feel-good chemicals.
No, it's highly specific. It's driven by error prediction.
Okay, break that down for us.
So when you're doing something difficult and you successfully navigate a small part of that challenge, like you place a difficult chess piece or write a perfect line of code, your brain releases dopamine to say, yes, that was correct, keep doing that.
It's a tight loop of positive reinforcement.
Exactly. And that loop locks your attention even deeper into the present moment.
Okay, but wait. If I'm doing the hardest thing ever, stretching my skills to the absolute limit, shouldn't my adrenaline be completely spiking? I mean, if I'm a rock climber literally hanging off a cliff, how do I stay calm instead of dropping into a full-blown panic attack?
That is such a good question. And it brings us to this tiny area in the brainstem called the locus coeruleus.
Which translates to blue spot, right?
Yes, the blue spot in Latin. So Dimitri van der Linden, a researcher at Erasmus University, Rotterdam, has done some incredible work on this specific mechanism. The locus coeruleus is the brain's main producer of noradrenaline.
And noradrenaline is the chemical that puts us into a state of physical and mental arousal.
Right. Too much noradrenaline and you're hyperventilating. Too little and you're falling asleep at your desk.
So how does the blue spot manage that during flow?
Van der Linden's research argues that during flow, the blue spot maintains a moderate, highly regulated baseline of activity. It just drips just enough noradrenaline to keep you fiercely alert and processing information rapidly, but it prevents that massive spike that causes overwhelming panic.
And the way they measure this is actually brilliant, right? They track pupil dilation.
Yes, because the locus coeruleus is directly linked to the muscles that control the pupil.
I love this study. So in a study van der Linden published in Scientific Reports, they had participants play highly complex memory games.
And they could literally watch the participants slip into flow through their eyes.
That's wild.
Their pupils would stay at this intermediate steady dilation, and the moment a relevant difficult challenge appeared on the screen, the pupil would rapidly dilate to handle the sudden cognitive load and then, boom, immediately snap back to that calm, intermediate baseline.
The brain was perfectly regulating its own arousal in real time. That is so cool because it's so measurable and concrete.
It really is.
But,
Hi.
okay, this leads me to a major question about how we actually study the brain in these states, because I notice a lot of our sources mention this very popular theory called transient hypofrontality during flow.
Oh, yes. It is one of the most widely cited theories in all of flow literature.
Right, and it's this idea that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain behind our forehead that does complex decision-making and houses our nagging inner critic, literally powers down, putting us on a kind of genius autopilot.
That's the theory, yeah.
But hold on, think about this logically. I want to push back on this. To see if the prefrontal cortex is powering down, researchers have to put someone inside an fMRI machine. Have you ever been inside an MRI scanner?
Unfortunately, yes. They are incredibly claustrophobic.
And loud. The magnetic coils sound like a literal jackhammer going off inches from your ears. If flow requires deep, uninterrupted focus and this delicate balance of challenge and skill, how on earth is someone supposed to achieve that state while shoved inside a noisy magnetic hospital tube?
Seems impossible.
It seems like the absolute worst environment to test this.
You've actually just hit on the exact critique raised by researchers Luis Siria, Daniel Sanabria, and Clara Alameda at the University of Granada.
Okay, so I'm not crazy.
Not at all. They published a major review pointing out this exact massive logistical flaw. They argue that the evidence for the prefrontal cortex simply shutting off is actually quite weak, precisely because the testing environment is so artificial and hostile to the state they're trying to measure.
Right, you can't get into flow while a machine is screaming at you.
Exactly. In fact, some of their data showed the prefrontal cortex becoming more active during flow, constantly updating strategies and processing complex rules.
So the idea that we just become these mindless zombies performing perfectly is likely a massive oversimplification.
Highly likely. The Granada researchers argue that to truly understand the prefrontal cortex's role, we need a complete paradigm shift in psychological science.
We have to stop relying on these artificially engineered, boring cognitive tasks inside noisy hospital scanners.
Yes. We need to study people in their natural environments. We need to put portable EEG skull caps on athletes while they're actually out on the basketball court.
Or hook up video gamers who are sitting comfortably in their own homes playing games they actually care about.
Exactly. And until the brain mapping technology catches up to natural human behavior, the exact mechanics of the prefrontal cortex will probably remain heavily debated.
Which is fair. But even if the hardware mapping is still a work in progress, there is fascinating data on who gets into this state the easiest.
Oh, the genetic factor.
Right, because if the biological hardware is basically the same for all of us, why does it seem like some people can slip into the zone instantly, while others struggle for hours just to write a single email?
Well, it turns out there is a significant genetic factor at play here. Studies comparing identical and non-identical twins have shown that your ability to enter flow, what psychologists refer to as your flow proneness, is partly written into your DNA.
That's kind of unfair, honestly.
It is. The research suggests genetics account for roughly 30% of the variance between individuals. It often comes down to individual differences in baseline dopamine levels and the density of dopamine receptors in the brain.
So some people's nervous systems are just naturally primed to lock into that tight error prediction reward loop faster than others. That's a huge revelation. Roughly 1/3 of our ability to get into the zone is just the biological hand we were dealt at birth. But okay, let's look at the math here. If 30% is genetic, that means a massive 70% is completely within our conscious control.
Exactly. You still have the majority vote.
So if you're listening to this and you want to build your own temple of flow, if you want to trigger this state on demand, how do you manipulate that 70%?
The absolute foundation, the golden rule that you simply cannot bypass, is balancing the difficulty of a task with your current abilities. Csikszentmihalyi called this the challenge skill balance.
I like to think of it as the Goldilocks zone of cognitive engagement.
That's a perfect way to put it, because if you're an expert chess player and you sit down to play against a 5-year-old, the challenge is simply too low.
Your brain recognizes that it doesn't need to allocate 120 bits of processing power to win.
So it doesn't. You fall out of flow and drop straight into the boredom zone where your DMN boots back up and you just start daydreaming.
Conversely, if you're a beginner who just learned how the knight moves and you try to play a grandmaster, the challenge is overwhelmingly high.
Right. Your amygdala perceives a massive threat of failure. It floods your system with stress hormones,
Yeah.
and you crash straight into the anxiety zone.
So flow lives perfectly in the middle. The task has to stretch you just slightly beyond your current comfort level, demanding your full attention without triggering panic.
And because your skills naturally improve the more you engage with the task, that sweet spot is constantly moving. You have to continuously adjust the difficulty upwards.
That makes a lot of sense. And once you establish that balance, you can start layering in what the Flow Research Collective calls flow triggers, right?
Yes, these are psychological and environmental inputs that tell your brain it's time to focus. Passion and curiosity are massive triggers. If you don't actually care about the task, your brain just won't commit the necessary energy.
Another highly practical trigger mentioned in the sources is setting SMART goals.
Oh, this is a big one.
Yeah, we all know the corporate acronym specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time-bound, but we rarely talk about why this matters for neurochemistry.
It's all about predictability.
Right. If you have a vague goal like, I'm going to work on my novel today, your brain doesn't know what winning looks like. It can't predict errors, so it can't release dopamine.
Exactly. Vague goals leave the brain guessing. But a highly specific goal like, I am going to write 500 words about the protagonist's childhood before 10 a.m. gives your brain a precise moment-to-moment roadmap.
It creates a tight feedback loop.
You know exactly if you are succeeding or failing in real time. That immediate feedback hijacks the brain's reward system, locking your attention fiercely into the present tense.
You also need to establish pre-flow transition rituals. You're trying to signal to your nervous system that it is time to shift gears from the chaotic, everyday world into deep focus.
It's basically applying classical conditioning to your own brain.
Yeah. It could be a 5-minute deep breathing exercise, a specific routine of stretches, or even just the deliberate act of brewing a specific type of tea before you sit at your desk.
You're building a habit loop. You do the routine enough times, and your brain starts to associate the smell of the tea or the physical stretches with the state of deep work.
It begins to automatically downregulate your stress hormones before you even start the task.
And many experts recommend that mindfulness meditation become a core part of this preparation.
Actually, let's draw a line there, because I think the terms mindfulness and flow are often used interchangeably in pop psychology, but our sources from Headspace draw a really clear, essential distinction between the two.
Oh, they definitely aren't the same thing.
Right.
These share a similar foundation. They both require stilling the mind and removing external distractions, but their end goals are entirely different. Mindfulness is about keeping your attention deliberately focused on observing yourself in the present moment.
So if you're doing a mindful workout, you're highly aware of your physical form. You're analyzing how your muscles feel, observing your breathing, noticing the sweat on your skin.
You're super present, but you are hyper-aware of yourself as the observer.
And flow is almost the inverse of that. Flow is when you allow your mind to get completely absorbed in the process. You aren't observing your muscles or analyzing your breathing. The you disappears entirely. You just dissolve into the action.
Exactly. Meditation is essentially the training ground. You sit on the cushion and practice the mental discipline of filtering out distractions.
You strengthen your ability to control your attention.
Right, so that when you sit down to work or play a sport, you have the focus required to slip into flow. Flow itself then becomes a highly active, moving meditation where the observer simply vanishes.
But, okay, if the formula is this straightforward, find the Goldilocks zone of challenge, set clear goals, and train your focus, why aren't we all walking around in a blissful state of flow at our office jobs every day?
I think we all know the answer to that.
Right. If you're listening to this at your desk right now, dodging Slack messages and urgent emails, the idea of completely losing your sense of time probably sounds totally impossible. So what are the modern blockers destroying this state?
Well, the ultimate flow assassins are digital clutter and multitasking. Every time your phone buzzes or an email notification pops up, it completely shatters that fragile state of concentration. The brain has to completely reset its focus.
It goes right back to the RAM limit we talked about earlier. Multitasking is a total myth.
It really is. You aren't doing two things at once. You're just rapidly switching your attention back and forth.
It's like forcing a sports car to constantly shift between first and fifth gear every 10 seconds. You're going to strip the transmission. You're burning massive amounts of processing power just opening and closing different mental apps, leaving absolutely no bandwidth for actual deep work.
Another major blocker is a lack of an internal locus of control.
What does that mean, practically?
It's the psychological belief that you have agency over your own outcomes. If you feel like you are just a victim of circumstance or, a cog in a machine simply following orders without any creative input, your brain won't commit the massive energy required to enter flow.
You have to believe your actions actually matter and influence the final result.
Exactly.
Looking at the sources from The Guardian and the Flow Research Collective, it actually seems like our modern obsession with productivity hacking might be self-sabotage.
Oh, absolutely.
We live in this extreme hustle culture, right? Everyone is trying to optimize every single second of their day, constantly comparing their output to whatever everyone else is doing on social media.
That's exhausting.
But by trying so incredibly hard to force ourselves into peak performance, aren't we creating the exact stress and rivalry that kills flow?
Yes. You are describing the paradox of control, which is honestly one of the most important concepts in the psychology of peak performance. Trying to force flow is the absolute antithesis of the state.
It just pushes it further away.
Flow thrives in an environment of relaxed engagement. It requires you to let go of the pressure. The moment you start stressing about the results or worrying about whether you are performing better than the person next to you, you immediately activate the amygdala.
The fear center turns on.
The blood flow shifts back to threat detection, your stress hormones spike, and flow vanishes instantly.
You cannot white-knuckle your way into the zone. It literally demands surrender to the process.
And it's crucial to understand that this state isn't reserved for extreme intensity. To prove that flow isn't just for Silicon Valley coders or extreme athletes, the Guardian piece highlighted the story of Julia Christensen.
Oh, this story was incredible.
She's a scientist at the Max Planck Institute, but before that, she was a professional ballet dancer.
Right, so she knew the flow state intimately. Her entire career was built on existing in that state of beautiful, thoughtless motion.
But then she suffered a career-ending back injury. And not only did she lose her livelihood and her identity as a dancer, but she lost her physical access to flow.
That's devastating.
She suddenly found herself dealing with the constant, overwhelming chatter of a mind that couldn't quiet down because her physical outlet for reaching that 120-bit threshold was just gone.
And she didn't find it again by taking up another extreme sport?
No, she found it again through the simple, quiet act of drawing. She started sketching dancers.
Wow.
The pure act of putting pencil to paper, focusing entirely on the curvature of the lines and the translation of movement onto a page, absorbed her attention enough to quiet her DMN. It brought her right back into flow.
It's a profound reminder that this state is accessible to everyone right now in the everyday activities of life. You don't need to be scaling Mount Everest or coding a billion-dollar app.
Not at all.
You can find flow tending to a garden, cooking a complex multi-course meal for your family, or just having a deeply engaging, distraction-free conversation with a good friend where you completely lose track of the time.
It's simply about finding an activity that genuinely absorbs you, matching your skill level to the challenge of the moment, and allowing yourself to enjoy the process purely for its own sake.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? It means that experiencing the absolute peak of human performance and happiness isn't about grinding yourself into exhaustion.
It's definitely not.
It's about finding that perfect, challenging sweet spot. It's about aligning your daily tasks with genuine passion and curiosity and fiercely guarding your attention against the constant barrage of digital clutter.
And most importantly, it's about letting go of your obsession with the end result so you can actually enjoy the ride.
Exactly. Because when you stop worrying about the finish line, you free up the bandwidth to run the race beautifully.
That's wonderfully put.
Which leads me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. We spend so much of our modern lives completely obsessed with finding ourselves. We curate our social media profiles, we meticulously build our personal brands, we are constantly analyzing our own identities.
It's a full-time job.
It really is. But if the science we've looked at today is right, if the absolute peak of human happiness, performance, and fulfillment literally requires our sense of self, our ego, and our perception of time to completely vanish, well, maybe the secret to a good life isn't about finding yourself at all.
That's a fascinating way to look at it.
Maybe, just maybe, it's about finding the right ways to regularly lose yourself.